Good morning, everyone. If you're on the East Coast of the US, it's good morning. If you're elsewhere, welcome. Or if you're watching this in recorded format, welcome. My name is April Doss. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and I am absolutely delighted that we are once again co-hosting with the Yale Information Society Project and my colleague Nicholas Guggenberger, our latest in a series of virtual events on AI governance. This is the fourth in our series of talks. We have also had talks on AI and smart cities, on an international comparative perspective of regulatory approaches to AI, on AI and corporate responsibility. We will be continuing this series of talks, so please keep an eye out on both the Yale ISP web pages and the Georgetown Tech Institute pages for announcements about future events. In the meantime, I would be remiss if I didn't note the significance of this date. We did not originally intend for this panel to fall on the newest US federal holiday commemorating Juneteenth, or Emancipation in the US, a vital historical moment in the US history as the US strives to become a more perfect union and live up to those constitutional ideals. And I am especially grateful to our panelists for being here with us on this day of commemoration. As you all know, today's topic is watching algorithms, AI and civil society. What is the role of civil society in AI governance? I am thrilled that we have an incredibly expert and knowledgeable panel here with us today. We have with us Julia Angwin, the editor-in-chief and founder of the Markup. Julia is a best-selling author, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, and founder and editor-in-chief of the Markup, which is, if you're not familiar with it, a nonprofit newsroom that investigates how powerful institutions are using technology to change society. We have Iverna McGowan, the Europe director for the Center for Democracy and Technology. Iverna is director of CDT's Europe office and an advocate for ensuring international human rights standards are at the core of law and policy related to technology. Prior to joining CDT, Iverna served as a senior advisor to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and previously served for 7 years as the executive director and advocacy director for Europe at Amnesty International's European Institutions Office. We also have David Robinson, visiting scientist in the AI Policy and Practice Initiative in Cornell's College of Computing and Information Science. David is a visiting scientist at Cornell. He studies the ways that algorithms, ethical commitments, and human identities influence and shape each other. He's currently working on a book about the ethics of the algorithm that matches American transplant patients with donated kidneys. Earlier in his career, he co-founded Upturn, an NGO that advances equity and justice in the design, governance, and use of digital technology. And lastly, as our expert moderator, we have Byron of the Wall Street Journal. You will probably be familiar with Byron's reporting. He covers a wide range of topics relating to data-driven technologies, surveillance, and the impacts of technology on society. So without anything further from me, Byron, I turn it over to you and to our esteemed panel. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you for that. So I'm planning to do about 10 minutes with each of the panelists, and that would save about 30 minutes for questions. So please think about questions, and when we open the floor to that discussion, please put them in the chat either to everyone or you can send them just to me. So I want to start with Julia. Could you set the stage for us? AI is a big buzzy word and involves a lot of different concepts. So what do generally people mean when we say AI?
That's such a great question. Thanks, Byron. And apologies, I have a little cold, so my voice is going to be a little scratchy. You know, AI means a lot of things, actually. Sometimes it just means software. And it's basically been used to talk about automated decision-making software. But the truth is that there is a lot of range in what people consider algorithmically driven software. So sometimes it means machine learning, which people use machines to look at data sets, see what their patterns are in there, and then use those to predict the future. And sometimes it's actually sort of rule-based. So there's a rule which is like, if there's this thing happens, then let's predict this other thing. And so it has come to mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I'm sure that there are people who will quibble with me and say that there's one definition that's the right one or not. But in my experience of writing about it, I've seen the term applied to so many different things that I've decided that I'm to be open-minded about what it actually is.
Besides the role of algorithms in criminal justice, which you've written about and we'll get to in a second, I mean, where are ordinary people starting to see AI creep up in their day-to-day lives?
I mean, actually, it's everywhere. So, you know, when you try to get a map on Google and it tells you what route to take, that's based, you know, some sort of prediction based on previous data and software. There's hiring is unfortunately much more based on this these days. A lot of people are using software to go through resumes and look through for keywords to figure out who they might move to the next stage in interviewing. It's used in criminal justice, as you mentioned. It is used in, you know, like the Uber drivers, right? They work for basically an algorithm. They are told where to go and what to do. This is true for a lot of the sort of gig economy. In Instacart, I think people have never, and actually many of these places, they never meet a person, right? Like they're hired by the app. The app tells them what to do. Their breaks, their whole schedule is determined by an algorithm. And so we're seeing it in lots of parts of life.
I want to ask specifically about the reporting you did when you were at your previous job, ProPublica. You looked at the application of AI algorithms in criminal justice. Can you tell us what you found there? Because I think it's an interesting window as to some of the moral and ethical issues and political issues that are raised when we're talking about AI, especially when the stakes are high, like in criminal justice.
Yeah, at ProPublica, I examined an algorithm that was at the time called Compass, and it was used in all sorts of different aspects of the criminal justice system. In some places, it was used as part of the pretrial release decision, whether or not basically to grant someone bail. In other places, it was used as part of sentencing or parole, but it was used throughout the country. And it was surprising to me when I heard about it and that it didn't have much independent analysis of whether it worked or whether it was biased against Black defendants, which is always a question in our criminal justice system, which is generally, you know, been biased against people of color. And so I decided to try to test this algorithm to see if it was working and if it was biased. So we went and obtained through public records requests 18,000 scores of people who had been assigned a risk score in Broward County, Florida. We got those scores, we looked at them and saw what everyone was rated 1 through 10. We then went and actually collected their future criminal records. So did they go on? This was attempting to predict, would they go on to get arrested for another crime? So we actually looked and saw whether they did go on to get arrested or not, and found that the score was not particularly accurate. It was about 60% accurate, and that its error rate was biased in the sense that Black defendants were much more likely to be given a high risk score when they did not go on to reoffend, and white defendants were much more likely to get a low risk score when they did go on to reoffend. And so it was an interesting finding, and it led to a debate that I think many people here might be familiar with about what is fairness. Is it fair to have differing error rates if it's equally predictive, which it was, if you understand the way that they define predictive. And so it's led to a lot of work and analysis, I think, in the computer science community. What's weird is that it hasn't really changed in the criminal justice community. There's this algorithm is still being used, and many like it across the country and are being institutionalized more and more.
What's the best case for using algorithms like this? Like, what are the people who defend these programs or these systems, you know, presented with your evidence and knowing that there's a high error rate and racial bias reflected in the outcomes? What's the best possible case for using things like this?
Well, the case that's always made, to me at least, is that it's better than humans, that humans are biased. And so the machine can overcome those human biases that, racist judges or, parole boards or something like that. But I think there are a couple reasons to question that premise. One is that algorithms, I think we are increasingly realizing, all they do is codify and institutionalize those biases. So they basically embed them in the software. So it's not removing the human bias, because human bias is in the data set that's used to develop the algorithm. And then also there's a question of, is it really fair to be using an algorithm to predict someone's future crime? Like, at a very high level, that is the antithesis of sort of how we view justice, right? That you are only being prosecuted for your past actions. And the idea of adding in some sort of prediction about your future actions is actually just at a very high level, philosophically, a question that I would raise about the use of these things. Because obviously I can see there are places where it's fine. Like, okay, if your Google Maps sends you on a bad route, yeah, it's annoying. And sometimes it's really annoying. People have driven into lakes or whatever. So there are problems. But when you're talking about like something really high stakes, like whether to incarcerate someone or not, it just raises a question about whether we want to put that decision in the hands of a machine. And the reason I say that that is a question is because machines are hard to hold accountable. You can hold people accountable for their decisions, but when it's put into a machine, then everyone says, oh, look, it's science, it's not my fault. And it's basically a way to shift responsibility for a very important decision. And that's a question I think we have to confront as a society, because there's a move to put algorithms in charge of very important high stakes human decisions. And I would argue that they're still not that great at getting us basically to the destination we want on Google Maps. And so like, are we really willing to put these things in charge of even more important decisions?
Is there a way to fix algorithms through the problems you've identified, reflecting racial bias and lack of transparency? Do you think there's a way to either mandate at the government level or at some other civil society level ways to mitigate or fix some of these issues that you've identified in your reporting, particularly this reporting on criminal justice?
I mean, I think you could probably move the dial, right? Like, I mean, the way that the findings that we had for Compass was that the error rate, was biased in a particular way for Black defendants versus white defendants. So you could move that dial and switch the error rates around. And that might do something. But it doesn't really answer the sort of larger question that I just raised, which is like, should you be judging people on their future predicted actions, right? Is that actually something that we want to do as a society? And so I think there are ways that we could tune algorithms to achieve better outcomes, maybe in certain arenas, but I'm not sure that I would start with incarceration as the first place to do that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, a lot of the discourse and debate around algorithms or AI focuses on the dystopic or the scary outcomes, but are there beneficial uses? Are there uses in journalism or other professions where we might say this is absolutely a great opportunity for efficiency or freeing up people to do tasks that they much more prefer to do rather than the drudgery?
Oh yeah, I mean, we use AI in our reporting, and I mean, ultimately, I think that the ability to take large data sets and classify them into different categories is something that, as a journalist, is really a powerful tool. It's something that I use all the time and my newsroom uses, and I've used in my previous jobs, because it allows you to see patterns in the data. That's the crazy thing about AI. It's actually very good at helping you diagnose reality right now. I'm just not entirely convinced that it's so good at predicting the future, particularly if you want the future to be different than the past. If you want it to look exactly like the past, then maybe, but if you want it to be in any way different or than the data you've trained it on, it isn't clear to me how you get there except with some crude measures. But in terms of diagnosing what's on the ground, what's happening in real life, like I think it's important. We did we built a tool when I was at ProPublica called the Political Ad Collector, which basically was a browser extension that people could add to their web browser. And when they were on Facebook, it would take the ads that were on their page, and then we used machine learning to figure out which ones were political, put those in a big public repository, because there was a feeling, I think, for many people after 2016, which was we need more transparency about what political ads were being shown on Facebook. And that's a really important tool for the public, right? So I think it's definitely an important tool. We just have to figure out where it's appropriate to use it.
Thank you, Julia. Iverna, I want to turn to you. Europe, as it so often is grappling with these issues at a regulatory level in a way that the United States isn't, given our different political traditions. So the EU has recently proposed, I guess, draft AI regulations or some sort of governing framework that attempts to create a regulatory structure. Can you give us a high-level overview of what is being proposed by the EU?
Sure. So they're calling it the Artificial Intelligence Act. And I should say, confusingly for many people, we've also got in the works the Council of Europe, which of course is a different body in Strasbourg that's coming up with an international convention on regulating AI as well. But the EU Act, so, in very broad strokes, what that is, it's still a proposal at this stage. It has to go through the European Parliament and Council and be debated. But what it's proposing is that basically it would be, government institutions that set the risk assessment. So to categorize what's considered a high risk AI, things like biometric surveillance, high risk to human rights or human dignity, things like recruitment would be put in there. So it kind of outlines in broad strokes what would be the different risks of different types and applications of AI. And then, is debating, there's some information in there, but there's still a lot of debate going on in Europe. Based on that risk, what kind of additional measures, regulation and mitigation strategies need to be put in place to regulate the particular application of AI. So that's at a very broad level. It's a huge piece of legislation. And I think one of the challenges is, as Julia has just outlined, even defining AI is so challenging. Also, the applications are such millions of potential applications. So I think one of the challenges itself is a single regulation that is taking on this mammoth task of trying to regulate an entire technology, software, whichever way we want to define it.
How should we all think about this risk-based approach that the EU is thinking about? Because I read some of CDT's comments on one of the proposals, and you do raise the specter of sort of what seems to be low risk algorithms like music recommendations, or as Julia said, directions, still having a real impact on people's lives and being worth thinking about. So how should we think about this sort of risk-based approach?
So I think what's really important, and again, if I draw on what Julia was saying, she was using examples in the criminal justice system in the United States, is that we should not neglect a rights-based approach in our pursuit of a risk-based approach, because, she gave the example to say that algorithms were being used in this predictive way, and was that fair? Fairness is one thing, but obviously people have a right to effective remedy, a right not to be discriminated against, a right to be innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. So I think that whilst the risk-based approach can be helpful given just the scale of applications of AI to help us focus or raise our attention, perhaps to say, look, we know recruitment has a particular risk of discrimination. We know criminal justice, because of the stakes are so high, we need to pay more attention. So I think the risk-based approach can be very helpful in honing our attention. But when we then get into the details of how we're going to mitigate and look at that, we need to go back to that rights-based approach of what does an effective remedy look like? And what are the existing laws and rules that need to be in play? And, what are we missing in terms of explainability or access to information to make those rights a reality? So whilst, exactly, I think that the risk-based approach helps us in kind of organizing our thoughts or honing in where the problems might be, but we should not rely on it alone, because sometimes it doesn't give us that real, real detailed safeguards and mitigation against actual rights violations or harms.
Can you expand on that? I mean, I think you've spoken in other contexts about how AI can actually erode the rule of law or the way we understand or have traditionally understood governance and individual rights and the relationship of the individual to the state. Can you talk about how AI threatens individual rights and the overall way that we've built legal structures in our society?
Sure. So I guess just taking a bit of a step back, and the rule of law is another thing that's challenging to define, but in very broad strokes, a definition of the rule of law would be all persons, institutions, public or private, including the state, are accountable to democratically adopted laws that are equally enforced and independently adjudicated. So that's kind of what we mean when we live in a society ruled by the rule of law. And that's where the point about, it can't be about fairness, that, well, everybody's treated equally by the bad algorithm. We need to look at it. If I take the example for recruitment, the Center for Democracy and Technology has done a lot of research in exposing, unfortunately, just the extent of the perpetuation of discrimination in access to employment. So in that case, you have, I can use the European example, we have a publicly democratically agreed laws about equal access to employment on protected grounds, whether it's for people of color, members of the Roma community, 7 different grounds that are protected. So that's a right that you have. And, for that right to become a reality, to have an effective remedy, you need to know that AI was used in the first place. You need to have explained to you how that decision was made, and you need redress or remedy. And because AI tends to have this focus of efficiency, right? Let's go through as many CVs as we can. The efficiency then trumps this rights-based approach, so that somebody doesn't even know that AI has been used. It can't be explained to them. And who is accountable? A key point in the rule of law to have your rights realized is this point of accountability. So that's one area. Another area that I know we might talk about a little bit later is things like, in the context of election, we see that content moderation is being increasingly automated. You can imagine that if a particular political campaign, etc., is being moderated or silenced by an algorithm where we're not totally sure what's going on, etc., what a major impact that could have in a democratic society. And again, considering that in our normal or in our analog periods, such questions might even come before a judge. Again, it raises serious questions about the rule of law in our societies.
On that content moderation question, I mean, how should we think about these questions, either from the level of being a citizen or from the level of regulators, about what it means when speech or participation in the democratic process are being affected by computer systems, often when there's no transparency or no real accountability for these things. I mean, how should we think about that, and how should we grapple with it as a society when so much speech is occurring on these platforms, and when these platforms are increasingly turning these decisions over to computer algorithms?
It's a really profound question. In Europe at the moment, another law, as you said, Europe is taking on this role of global regulator at the moment. We have what's called the EU Digital Services Act. So it's the equivalent of Section 230 in the United States, but a lot more as well. Some people are dubbing it the new constitution of the internet because it's going so far into trying to regulate online content. And that regulation is throwing up all of the challenges. So on one hand, what I think is very important, and at CDT we've supported that concept, is that it's bringing some mandatory transparency to how recommender systems work and how algorithms are working online, so that we can at least allow civil society, other authorities, researchers to really understand what's going on and then take relevant measures against it. On the other hand, what's worrying, even in the draft DSA, is that they are tinkering with intermediary liability. So ironically, in some places, again, for the case of efficiency, because of the scale of communications, at the moment, the current draft is suggesting that platforms take a larger role in debating, what's legal online and what's not, etc. And that's quite worrying, again, from the rule of law perspective, because we need to figure out a way, of course, that really important matters of speech in the context of an election or more generally are independently adjudicated. I do think one other point that is related, how disinformation is spread online, and again, the Center for Democracy and Technology has done extensive research on this. We need to also be honest about the drivers of disinformation and how the use of personal data can actually feed the beast, if you like, of these algorithms and create some of the difficulties that we then see online, whether it's about disinformation or the spread of hateful content. So I think what's really important in the content moderation debate is to try and take it away from, you know, government or platforms adjudicating individual pieces of user speak and actually opening up the conversation, look, taking up the curtain, but how do these recommender systems work? What is the use or abuse of personal data behind it that's driving what we see online? And I think when we get down to that level of detail, that's really the core of the issue. And I think federal level privacy legislation in the US would be a really important tool as well. I know sometimes politicians like to focus only on the individual content, but we need to really focus on the mechanisms, I think, to ultimately come to a more democratic solution.
Thank you for that. David, I believe you have a real world parallel or an example of how you think a sort of productive conversation or framework for dealing with AI might look like. Can you tell us first, what is this parallel and why do you think it has applications to other areas of AI?
Absolutely. Thanks, Byron. And thank you, Iverna. I could hardly have asked for a better transition. We need to focus on the mechanisms. I've been looking actually since I was teaching at Georgetown, and some students identified this example for a final paper, and I just became mesmerized by it, which is the US system for allocating organs that are donated. They're a non-market good, of course, so there's a public interest in how they're allocated. There are about 100,000 people waiting for kidney transplants in the United States, and something like 10 to 15,000 donated kidneys a year that can be transplanted. And as at the very moment that a organ becomes available, out of that 100,000 people, it's necessary to rapidly identify who's the recipient, because you've got a short window of time to actually move the organ. There are all kinds of factors, not only logistical, but blood type and other medical factors, and also ethics. Like, for example, do you want to maximize the total number of life years saved, which was a goal that they remade this algorithm recently. And that's what my recent study has been about, is how that went. And their first idea was to maximize the life saved, but it turns out that that means you're favoring younger and healthier organ recipients, which also has racial and wealth-based, right? People with fewer comorbidities and better access to care can turn the same organ into more years of added survival. So it would have had this inequitable impact, and it was initially proposed, but then all of these systems that had been set up for public input, for transparency, for auditing, for simulating what the algorithm would do before it was put into place, led to a change. And now there's a process which is much more sort of something closer to first come, first serve, out of an interest in fairness. And so, you know, there are all of these mechanisms that have been proposed, both in policy making and also in the scholarly literature. What does an institutional architecture look like for governing AI? There are all kinds of ideas. Mandatory stakeholder input into an algorithm's design, like requiring a representative group of people to weigh in, transparency practices like disclosure of the logic of how the algorithm works, accountability, like having the performance monitoring be done by a different organization than the one that actually makes the algorithm, forecasting or simulating what it would do. And then, you know, once something is out there, having this sort of ongoing process of auditing. And all of those things have been happening in the transplant community since the 1980s. And so there's really decades of experience. It's a mixed bag. I'm not saying they've got everything perfect. In fact, it's inevitably imperfect and tragic. It's what's called in the law literature a tragic choice, because we can't save all the lives that need saving, but they have found tolerable compromises. And I think that's worth learning from.
I want to drill down on the role the government played in this example. I believe the US Congress actually played a role in setting kind of a high-level policy that organs could not be sold, and ordered some sort of framework to be set up. Can you walk us through the role the government played in creating this system of organ matching, because I think this is a panel on civil society, and this is an example, as you point out, of something that does look like a conversation on this.
Yeah, so I mean, what happened was at the very beginning, transplants were hard to do because you had to have a real close match between the donor and the recipient. Like the first viable kidney transplant was between identical twins, actually, in the 1950s. And so basically, individual pioneering surgeons and centers would start to assemble lists of people and they would try things. But then in the 1980s, there was a new drug called cyclosporin, and that could suppress people's immune systems. And what that meant was that lots of strangers could be recipients for any given organ. And that meant, okay, we have to coordinate something. So there was a widespread, actually a global consensus with some asterisks, but basically a global consensus that organs shouldn't be bought or sold. It's actually a moral debate whether that's a good idea or not, because you could say, you know, you don't want obviously to have a private, totally private market in organs, because that would have all kinds of unfair effects. But you could also have, for instance, the government as a centralized single compensator. So there's a whole interesting debate about that. But I think what is, you know, really important here is Congress said, first of all, they didn't want to. There was sort of this moral hot potato, right? They didn't want to be saying who should be the people who get this, and so they actually in the National Organ Transplantation Act, they said there should be a panel of experts. Then the experts said there should be a panel of lay people, and actually that idea of having lay input dated to the invention of dialysis, which was, you know, could keep people alive who couldn't get a transplant, where there weren't enough machines to go around. But the physician said, okay, we need community members to help us to decide which of the medically eligible people, you know, should be saved. So there's this long tradition, really from before algorithms, right? There was this long tradition of community input into this hard moral choice. And, you know, that kind of survived into the world of what is now a nationwide, you know, data matching system.
So you have kind of a high-level regulatory mandate. You have a nonprofit staff of experts. You also have input from the public or from lay people. There's also some degree of transparency and you know, clearly articulated goals in the design of the system. How's it working? I mean, I know nothing in this time is without controversy, but in general, is this system seen as fair and equitable?
I mean, I think the answer is, although it's complicated, I think it's making progress on fairness and equity. There are, so I'll say two things that I think we can learn from this. One of them is that the use of an algorithm, the debate over an algorithm tends to sort of act like a moral spotlight. It focuses us on certain aspects of fairness. So for instance, in the example that Julia gave earlier, you know, the bias by race. And then there are other questions which, you know, if you sort of take a step back, you think, wait, should we be using an algorithm for this in the first place? Like, should we even have this kind of a courtroom, right? There are these other ethical questions. Similarly, in transplant, you know, once you're looking at the algorithm, your question is, okay, for the people on the list of possible recipients, how good of a job is the algorithm doing at fairly deciding which of those people should get an organ, right? That's in the spotlight. What's not in the spotlight is how do people get onto the list in the first place, right? Or if they get an organ, do they have the support that they need in order to, you know, continue in good health? So there's an issue where you only get a few years of reimbursement. You can be on dialysis as long as you like, but only a few years of support for keeping that organ in good condition. The immunosuppressive drugs, Medicare stops paying for them, right? Like that's out of scope. But if you are thinking about how well are we doing transplant, ethically speaking, you have to look not only at the algorithm, but also kind of around the algorithm. So I think that's one lesson, is that the fairness conversation is larger than the technical details. The other one is, you know, when people talk about public input, there's often this idea that we're going to go out and kind of harvest opinions from civil society groups as if those opinions were static, right? And we're going to kind of take that input as if it were like something we would go out and mine and put it into this machine. But the reality that is illustrated in the transplant case is that debate creates opinions. So at the beginning, lots of people thought, oh, we should maximize the total amount of life saved. Then there was all this simulating, there were public discussions, right? And people sort of realized what that would look like in practice. And they said, okay, this sounded like a good idea, but now we think, no, we should do something that's closer to first come, first serve, that uses waiting time more. And I think that kind of process, which by the way is slow and messy and not completely satisfying, of kind of the sharp edges of individual opinions getting kind of worn off. I think about like the way that sometimes gems are polished, where you take a bunch of sharp stuff and you put it in this kind of tumbler, right? And it tumbles around until it sort of gets to something that's a little bit softer, or where the hard edges are sort of worn off. That's a process that happened here. And I think if we think about, if we're creating a process for public input, that we should expect some of the slowness and the messiness, but also the sort of, you know, emergence of mutual tolerance that we see from democratic processes elsewhere.
I want to encourage everyone to start populating the chat with questions, because I'm about to switch to a more public version of this discussion. But one final question for you: what are the applications for what you've learned in looking at this this organ matching system to other aspects of AI? Is this a unique case, given the, you know, the specifics of this particular setup, or is this something that kind of everyone who's starting to use algorithms in any application could look at and take lessons from?
Right. This is sort of the meta transplant question. Can we transplant what we've learned here into criminal justice, or, you know, a hiring algorithm? I mean, I think the answer has to, in part at least, be yes. So, which is not to say that any two cases are exactly alike. But for example, I spent years after Julia's brilliant work on the pretrial courtroom stuff, working on courtroom algorithms myself. And as she pointed out, there is this question about whether we even want this kind of a court system. But in many places, these algorithms for assessing risk are being implemented. And you know, there are questions in some of those places. The question isn't whether we should do it, but how to do it as close to quote unquote right as we can. And we've seen tremendous problems. Like, for example, the systems are poorly understood. So, you know, we've seen documentation that, like, there isn't stakeholder input. The systems are opaque. The goals are poorly specified, like risk of what exactly should we predict, or the goals are incompatible with controlling law, or the systems haven't been tested, or they're not being monitored, you know, or updated in response to changing ground conditions. And so I think what we see in the transplant case is a concrete illustration that some of those things can be dealt with. Like, I think this external auditing idea is one that seems to me pretty clearly, you know, movable across context, right? And this idea of publishing in detail, what is the logic of this system, what data comes in, what judgment comes out, and building a shared understanding of that.
Thank you for that. So we have a question from Michael Chen, and what he asks is, how do we hold algorithm developers or the corporations that deploy these algorithms responsible when there's a negligent catastrophic error? So he gives the example of a self-driving car running over someone because engineers turned off the auto braking feature, or, for example, you know, we've heard of examples of algorithms having to make choices between, you know, killing one person or killing another person in the self-driving car context. So when we're starting to talk about these algorithms controlling things in the physical world that could potentially, or even not, that could potentially have legal ramifications, liability, how do we deal with this? Iverna, do you want to take this one?
Sure, and that's again a very live debate in Europe at the moment, because we're looking at different ways of what's being called mandatory due diligence for companies. And so that's to say, you know, that there would be mandatory due diligence, including external auditing of algorithms, checks and balances, and in some cases, if the risk is very high, a real restriction on the extent to which AI can be used. And that's, you know, one of the approaches that's being considered, to make it a little bit easier, at least to make it clear about accountability. I think the challenge remains to the questions that we're having is that when the stakes are so high as to, you know, a human life, are we there yet that we can even, you know, because even to somebody whose loved one has died, etc., it's not really the best to say, well, at least the company is being held to account. I think we really need to perhaps be more cautious depending on the risk and on life of how we do that. And perhaps that can be part of this assessment of due diligence, to say, is it possible that due diligence alone can reduce a risk that it's negligible? Or when we do that initial analysis, do we say actually the stakes are too high in this case and the technology is not quite there yet? We also have this discussion in again in the case to use recruitment, and also in the case of social security, so allocation of resources by government operatives. And there, under European Union law, for example, it's the employer that is accountable, and the burden of proof in a case of discrimination actually shifts to the person in the recruitment process. So that's really interesting, because the recruiter might say, well, actually, it's the people, the vendors who developed the AI recruitment tool that should be held to account. So in that case, I think that we do have to make that link to make sure that the existing laws are actually enforceable, and say, well, there has to be maybe due diligence on the employer, and that in addition to maybe the AI that's being used, first that the AI has been adequately, examined and audited, etc., but also that the employer doesn't just wash their hands completely and say that it's the vendor alone, because they, legally speaking, still have ultimate responsibility not to discriminate in a hiring practice. So I do also think, again, with just how widespread the use of AI is, that we might have to look at individual applications. What are the existing laws and rights at stake? And then look at which ways are most appropriate to hold companies or developers or others to account.
Julia, how is this debate about legal accountability playing out in the United States, either in the context of companies making sort of physical hardware, or even in the context of, the criminal justice example that you gave us? For example, could a prisoner sue the company that created the algorithm, and could they seek redress in the courts over their risk score, for example?
I mean, it's hard to sue over your risk score, right? Because your argument is, I'm not a 7, I'm a 4, right? And like, you don't know how 7 or 4 got calculated. And so that's why I think there's a real philosophical reason about whether this satisfies the due process that we think we have in our criminal justice system. But I do think that in general, liability is a great tool for accountability. And if you think about Boeing 737 MAX and that algorithm, which led to the loss of a lot of lives, it did have that early inspection that it was inspected by the FAA apparently, but no one sort of predicted this. And this is one of those problems with algorithms, is they're not particularly explainable. The more complex the software gets, the harder it is to really determine what the software is going to do. And but I would like to believe that the fact that Boeing had to pay so much for those people's lives who were lost would be a real incentive to do better next time. And I do think that, like, I think one thing in general about software is that software makers have generally not been subject to liability. And so there isn't an insurance market for software right now. And I think that would help. I think if you had liability where the company that made the software was on the hook for bad things that happened, an insurance market would arise that would then pay out claims and would inspect software to make sure it wasn't too risky. These markets aren't perfect, but they are better than we have right now, which is sort of a liability-free situation.
David, do you want to briefly come in on this one?
Yeah, just quickly, I think that it's absolutely the case that there are places where tort, can be a valuable tool, where suing can be a valuable way of addressing this. But at the same time, as Julia was saying, it's often quite difficult for an individual litigant to find out the things that would be necessary in order to wage an effective lawsuit. And that's one of the reasons that our topic today, this civil society focus, I think is so important in the context of algorithms, is because the sort of challenge of understanding it is really a central one, that kind of, you can make people reinvent the wheel in trying to figure out what's actually happening, but that turns out to impede accountability. So I think both, from the point of view of what kinds of accountability structures do we build in government, but also the kinds of advocacy that, Julia's newsroom does, or that NGOs like CDT can do, or that Upturn can do, where I used to be myself. I mean, you can't do without that. There's a piece here that individual litigants, I think, can't do for themselves. And that's part of why these group efforts are needed.
David, I'm also going to direct this next question at you because it's about healthcare and you've been swimming in those waters for a little while. So Supriyo asks that about healthcare data and the fact that a lot of patient healthcare data is being fed into algorithms, sometimes for commercial purposes that do not necessarily benefit the patient. Meanwhile, the regulatory framework for healthcare is the 25-year-old law HIPAA. What are your thoughts on the governance of healthcare data? Because you can obviously see applications for, say, feeding cancerous moles into a machine learning algorithm that can better identify and quickly diagnose cancer. On the other hand, you could see problems with healthcare data being used in commercial ways. So how should we think about this?
I mean, I think this is actually one of the best arguments that's available to people who say that a comprehensive regulatory regime with respect to privacy and AI of the kind being pursued in Europe is necessary. And that is that in the US, we have this very sector specific approach. So for instance, if the data is health data, quote unquote, then a set of laws apply to it that don't apply to non-health data. And the question that comes up is, what about my Fitbit? What about a picture of my skin that might have a picture of a mole but wasn't taken in a doctor's office, right? It's like, at that point, we end up in a world in which, because the rules are much more stringent for health data, there's this incentive, weirdly, to innovate around the edges, because if you can do something that involves data which is not officially health data, then it's much easier to collect a lot of it and analyze a lot of it. And so I think it's a very challenging space for the United States right now. And I agree that the sort of the HIPAA constraints are struggling. I think another piece that comes up in health data is, as Julia was saying earlier, we have a system that's great at finding patterns and great at projecting those patterns into the future. But for example, if you predict medical needs based on past medical usage, one of the things in sort of our research area of fairness and sort of algorithms where I'm active, there was a great study that showed that an algorithm that predicts needs based on past usage is going to underserve people who previously were underutilizers of the system. So like Black patients who either there wasn't the trust there or there wasn't the access, and who made fewer health claims, were given less proactive services because they were seen as less likely to need help. But that was only because it wasn't in the data. So I think, when we do use health data, we need to be intentional about what are the social surrounds. As I was saying earlier, like zooming out the camera a little bit, not just what is happening in the data, but what's happening in the doctor's office and the society.
Iverna, how's the EU thinking about health data in particular when it's looking at these draft AI rules?
But I think it's important to recognize, obviously, that the GDPR already exists. So that is a very broad, of course, privacy data law. And within GDPR, there is a special status there's an article in GDPR that describes highly sensitive data, and there's a number of different categories, including health. And because indeed the GDPR is what we call like a horizontal regulation that goes cross-cutting, it would not be as easy in the European context to say that, oh, because it's your Fitbit or because it's outside of a doctor's office, it's more focusing on the type of data rather than the context that it's in. And then obviously, so we already have quite stringent protections through the GDPR about how that data is used and processed. There's debates about the enforcement of GDPR, given what we've seen about the real life use and abuse of that data. And when it comes to then the AI Act, what that is looking at is it's looking at an extra layer to say, again, applying this risk-based approach to when it comes to health and there's risk to human life, what additional measures might we need in addition to the GDPR to mitigate any risks. So I think that obviously one of the things that GDPR is really about privacy, but obviously it doesn't factor in, for example, discrimination or other impacts on consumer rights and other elements. So one of the things that the AI Act is trying to do is to look at where the gaps are, to say GDPR brings us so far with health data, but if it's actually AI decisions in terms of, again, social security allocation in the case of health or making diagnostic decisions or others, what additional layers and, auditing or safeguards do we need to put in place? That's where the debate is circling in Europe at the moment.
We have a comment in the chat from Cass Park, who makes sort of the best case for the use of algorithms in criminal justice, which is that essentially the judges already are biased, first of all, they do take into account the risk of future offenses. They are beholden to certain constituent pressures. They are themselves humans, and all humans are subject to bias. And then AI is a potential way to mitigate human bias. Julia, do you want to respond to that idea? I know we talked a little bit about it, but there is some belief that a computer cannot be racist, right? It's just a pile of silicon and some electrodes. So if the system is properly designed, it could potentially be a better way to do judging or to be impartial. How do you respond to that, having looked at this in practice and as it exists now?
Yeah, I'm happy to, but I think I would also kick it a little bit to David, who probably is going to have some good thoughts here. But I would just quibble slightly, right? Computers, yeah, of course, computers aren't racist. They're just hardware. But the software that runs on them can be racially biased because it's written by humans and it embeds those rules, right? As Larry Lessig said, code is law. And basically, whatever you put into the code is what you have decided that the law will be. And so certainly the algorithms used in criminal settings use variables that everybody acknowledges can be proxies for race. Even before I did my analysis, there was decades of legal work saying that these scores were likely to be biased because of the fact that they were proxies for race and for living in poor communities. It's also, by the way, well known that these algorithms were biased against women. A woman who got a medium score was actually not as likely to reoffend as a man who got a medium score. And so women were more like, the judges, this is true to this day, are supposed to mentally discount a woman's score in their mind down to a low as compared to a man. So algorithms absolutely have biases embedded in them. Yes, so do humans. And there's an argument that is true, which is that I was able to do this analysis because I could take all of the scores by this one system, and then I could hold this one system to account. And that is an advantage over a judge, right? Like I could have, I guess, taken each judge's rulings and done some sort of comparison about which judges are worse, and journalists do those kinds of things occasionally. But I don't know that that's actually an argument for this being a better system. But I want to toss it to David because I feel like he's going to bring more here.
Thanks, Julia. And I agree. I think we've all agreed, and probably the questioner agrees that there can be bias in the data that's used in these systems, and that in fact any observation of the social world, it's like you're holding up a mirror to an ugly social reality. And so there is that reflection. I do think that, as you were saying, the strongest, as a questioner, and Julia, you were both saying that the strongest, I think, version of argument in favor of doing this is not that algorithms aren't biased, but that humans also are. And that's true. And there's empirical work, right, about the particular biases of, what time of day is it? And what, has the judge, is the judge hungry at the time that they're making the decision? And by the way, there's cognitive science that says that the reasons that humans give for why they act or decide a certain way are not in fact descriptive of the true reasons why people act or decide the certain way. And we can even see people initiating the decision before the reasons that they give have happened, where like this, if you're in a functional MRI machine, the story you tell about why you decided can't possibly be true. And so I think that does raise, questions about this. And I do think also that at the bottom of this, there's something that is a little bit separate from the question of how biased the judge is and how biased the algorithm is. And Julia, you were pointing at this earlier, and I just want to lift this up again, is, it might be that there's something separate that makes it a good or a bad idea to use one or the other of these systems. And in particular, if the idea is that the judge is like the person being judged, right? That the positions could be reversed. There's some inherent dignity in the idea that I am being judged by a person like myself, right? The same category of, but for an older view might be, but for the grace of God, the positions could be reversed. And that's part of what makes this morally legitimate practice. And so, when you have an algorithm deciding, perhaps you lose that, and perhaps that's worth something that's a separate discussion from the question of how biased or accurate either one is.
Yeah, can I just jump in and say, like, I think that one thing that is really important to talk about when you talk about algorithms is actually where they're used and on whom. Because the truth is there are people who are not subject to the algorithm and people who are. And ultimately that is the distinctive factor, right? People who look like me are not as subject to the algorithm as other people. And that's, like the TSA line, right? There's the people who go through the fast one and there's people who go through the slow one. And that's a system that Virginia Eubanks writes about a lot in her book, Automating Inequality, which is really important because we tend to use these systems on vulnerable, marginalized communities who don't have any right. They don't have as much way to fight them. And that's not an accident.
We have about 4 minutes left. David, I want to throw this, maybe the last audience question to you. Michael Chen asks if government should do more to incentivize research into safe and explainable AI rather than simply intelligent AI. So I guess the question is intelligence the correct lodestar when we're talking about the public funding of research into this, and should governments do more to incentivize transparency and other values in their funding their research?
Yeah, I think they should. And I think actually that it's a very important, as an international relations observation, I think it's very important to have public investment in the development of AI. And we're seeing that in other countries, and China is sort of the go-to example there, but it's happening, I think, worldwide. And there are a whole lot of reasons why understanding how to build these systems is important, and why having kind of some consonance between who's building it and what their incentives are, and what kind of a world we want to live in, compatibility between that is really important. And that's, I think, one reason that it's a little bit worrying to see corporate research so far outstrip what is happening in academia and the public sector. And you see, leading machine learning researchers getting absorbed into huge companies where their research sort of goes dark. It's of course good when companies publish and share stuff, but I think having public investment, not only in accuracy and overall system performance, but also in sort of performance that matches our values, maybe is the way I would sort of summarize that set of concerns, I think is vitally important. I think it is happening. And in fact, as I understand, there's a major new investment that's working its way through the Congress in this era where almost nothing can be agreed to. And I'm glad that is happening.
Perfect. Well, I think we will have to leave it at that. I wanted to say thank you to all our panelists, and I am going to turn the microphone over to Kyoko, who is going to close us out.
Amazing. So much more we could talk about here, but that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and our co-hosts at the Yale Information Society Project, I would like to thank Mr. Byron Tao for moderating so adeptly, and Ms. Julia Angwin, Ms. Iverna McGowan, and Mr. David Robinson for volunteering their expertise, their insights, and their time. I also thank the audience for joining us remotely from around the globe throughout the AI Governance series. We'll be resuming the series in September with a number of new topics and a new set of distinguished participants. By early autumn, you will find details about these events posted to the websites and Twitter feeds of the Yale ISB and the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I look forward to seeing you then.